Example one, suppose that an exporter wants to raise 40 million to invest in a project that would produce 20 million per year for the next 3 years if exchange rates remain stable, or 15 million per year for the next 3 years if exchange rates rise. Both states are equally likely. So just as before, I want you to pause, go ahead and set up the problem and work through it. And in the notes that are posted on Blackboard, you have the solutions. But before you look at the solutions, pause, work through the question. Part A, we're going to assume the firm's cost of capital is 8% and find the NPV. In part B, at the end of year 3, the project has a disposal cost of 4 million if exchange rates are stable and 2 million if exchange rates rise. What is the NPV of the investment? The way to think about the disposal cost is at the end of year 3, so year 3, you're going to have this additional cost. So you know a cost is a thing you pay for, so you're going to have this negative. Okay. And then lastly, suppose that we learn with certainty that exchange rates will rise and that instead of facing a disposal cost, the project can be sold off for 2 million. So in part C, we no longer have uncertainty. Now we're sure that the rates are going to rise. And we know the project can be sold off at the end of year 3, as opposed to us facing a disposal cost. So what is going to be the NPV of the project given those facts? Okay, the one thing I want to point out for example one, notice that in this case, if exchange rates remain stable, the project's going to produce cash flows of 20 million per year. And if they rise, the cash flows are going to be 15 million per year. So the exchange rate is moving in the opposite direction of the cash flow. And hopefully that makes intuitive sense given what we've talked about with exporters. Example two, suppose that an importer wants to raise 12 million for a project that would produce 1 million per year in perpetuity if exchange rates fall, or 3 million per year in perpetuity if exchange rates rise. Both states are equally likely. The same setup. Go ahead, solve it out. For part A, assume that the firm's cost of capital is 15%. What is the NPV of the project? For part B, suppose instead that the manager will wait 5 years to undertake the project. How much is the project worth today? Okay. Clearly, in both of the examples, we can see how the current account is going to be sensitive to exchange rate changes. If you remember, when we looked at our graph of the percentage changes in imports and exports, we said that they were co-integrated, that they co-move, they have a lot of commonality. And what we suggested was that maybe that commonality is driven by exchange rates. So in example one, the exporter faces lower cash flows when exchange rates rise. That is, you have higher exchange rates are going to make the exported goods or services more expensive. So logically, we're going to assume you'll sell less and have lower net cash flows, all else equal. In example two, we're dealing with an importer. So the importer faces higher cash flows when the exchange rates rise. The exact opposite. And hopefully that makes intuitive sense. The higher exchange rate would make the imported goods or services less expensive. So if I'm importing goods or services, I have a higher exchange rate. Now those imports are even cheaper to me. So we're now assuming that the firm would sell more or have a lower cost of goods. Either way, we're expecting higher net cash flows in example two. So we can see from the previous graphs that the demand for USD on the Forex market runs hand in hand with the trade balances. That suggests that currency depreciation, i.e. reducing the exchange rate, can increase exports and reduce imports if both are super responsive to changes in the exchange rate. So we'll call that elastic. If the prices are very responsive to changes, if the goods are very responsive. However, if the goods are not very responsive to changes, then the devaluation could worsen a trade balance. And the way to think about that, if we're importing and exporting, if our country is importing and exporting goods that really aren't super sensitive to exchange rates, devaluing the currency won't help to export more. Devaluing the currency won't help to reduce imports. Not that that should be an objective at all. Okay, recent trends in the balance of payments. So as we mentioned, the US current account deficit and capital account surplus have just been there for quite some time. The US has ran current account deficit since 1982, meaning that the exports have been lower than the imports, and capital account surpluses, meaning there's been more financial flows in than there have been flows out. So let's put that together. We have more exports, sorry, we have we have lower exports than imports, and we have more investment that comes in than goes out. Another country that has a very similar situation that you may not have thought about is the UK. The UK has ran current account deficits and capital account surpluses generally since the 1980s as well. And you'll see that in the graphs below. So on the left-hand side, we've got the UK current account as a percentage of GDP. And what you'll notice is that since the 80s, that line has been well below zero for quite some time. And on the right, we have UK capital flows. And hopefully what you observe are two things. One, the capital flows are fairly volatile. They move up and down a lot. But two, for the most part, they tend to be above zero. So the UK tends to attract more capital investment than it sends out. And like the US, the UK tends to import more than it exports. That's not true for everywhere. So we do have countries that tend to export more than they import, like Japan, Germany, and China. Japan has ran a current account surplus and a capital account deficit. Japan's current account surplus and capital account deficit have been there since 1982. That's surprising given the yen's steady rise in value. The reason why that's surprising is because, as we said, when the currency appreciates, it's going to attract foreign investment, because as an investor, I'm going to be looking for ways to preserve my value. So I want a currency that's appreciating, and I want a stable currency. And the yen's been rising quite some time. So it's surprising that even with that increase, and even with that increase in its relative price, the appreciation of the exchange rate hasn't been enough to attract enough investment to turn it into a capital account surplus. Okay, Germany has also ran current account surpluses. China, truly amazing, has ran a surplus on the current account and the capital account until very recently. So if you look at the graph to the right, you'll notice that in 2019 and in 2018, China had capital account deficits. But for the most part, China tends to run a capital account surplus, meaning that China exports more than it imports, that's the current account surplus, and that China generally has attracted more investment in than it's made investment out. So let's put that all together. When we put that all together, there's this notion that many economists refer to as the global imbalance. And the key idea is that some countries like the US and UK tend to use more outputs than they produce. That is, the US and UK run current account deficits. So X minus M is negative. They export less than they import. However, countries like Germany, China, and Japan tend to do the opposite. They tend to run current account surpluses, meaning that they produce more than they use up. The other side of that is the global savings glut. So this is sort of the financial side of the global imbalance. The key idea is that countries like Japan, Germany, and China, and many developing countries have large savings from all the exporting, and they need to invest that in places that are going to have preservation of value. So they're going to end up investing in places that have financial account surpluses. The capital inflows strengthen the USD and strengthen the pound, which encourages imports in the US and the UK. As residents' buying power increases, the foreign goods are going to become cheaper. So the capital flows in, it makes imports cheaper. It also hurts exports because now the exported goods are going to become more expensive. Thus, the financial inflows strengthen the currency, which can lead to a current account deficit. So the global imbalance and the global savings glut, these are sort of these are different ways of analyzing and explaining our current situation with the balance of payments across countries and the current system that we have. As we discuss these current trends in the balance of payment, we should also look at a period in which the balance of payment, this free flow of goods and people between countries, has come into question. So let's look at the Brexit. So, what is this? Britain formally exited the EU in January 2020, but it took 11 months for negotiators to settle on terms. The British Office of Budget Responsibility, basically an independent organization that's there to do a thorough accounting of British economy, estimated that leaving the EU could reduce British economic output by a cumulative of 4% over the next 15 years. So that's very costly. Why would leaving matter so much? First, Europe is Britain's largest source of foreign investment and its major export market. Second, the EU functions as a single common market, meaning goods and services and capital can move freely between member countries. Third, the EU is also a customs union, meaning members agree to the same taxes and tariffs on outside goods. So if you put those together, largest source of foreign investment, major export market, functions as a common market, meaning that goods and services and capital can all move freely, and serves as a customs union. So what you export and what you sell doesn't face individual tariffs. That's a lot to work through and a lot to negotiate and a lot. The reason that becomes a lot is now you have to have individual agreements with each individual country as opposed to one agreement with the whole bloc. So background. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community, a precursor to the EU. In 2013, so 40 years later, Prime Minister David Cameron promised a public vote. So he proposed that there'll be a public referendum and the choices are going to be remain or leave. Cameron believed that voters would support staying in the EU. He was wrong. June 23rd, 2016, in the midst of a significant migrant crisis that was happening throughout Europe, voters in Britain, 52% said, let's leave the EU. After lengthy negotiations, Britain and the EU reached a new trade agreement on Jan 1, 2021. The new trade deal allowed Britain to avoid high tariffs and quotas on exports. Quotas are basically limits that are put in place to kind of reduce the amount of goods that are going to flow into the country. However, even with these new requirements, there are still many challenges for British exporters. So you have tens of millions of customs declarations. You have new health and safety assessments. Now, a good from Britain, it's treated essentially no different as something from Chile, Thailand, Australia. So you basically face all of these increased hurdles that you didn't have in place before if you were an exporter. The deal also ends the free movement of people between Britain and the EU. So that presents a major challenge for the British service sector. Remember, we said that the trade of services has become incredibly important in the US and in the UK and in many other developed countries. Okay, so Britain's service sector, financiers, lawyers, consultants, medical, etc., they account for 80% of British economic activity in 2019. So this is particularly difficult for financial firms. It was the case that if I'm a bank, I'm able to provide common services to my clients across the EU. which is something you would love as a financial institution because you can leverage your people, you can leverage your ability to make a market in Munich or in Lisbon, all the way from London. Now that's done. So European regulators will determine what bank gets to do what, where, and how. And there were cases reported, at least in the New York Times, of Britons abroad already being told that their bank accounts would no longer be there. Their bank accounts were going to be closed because of this inability to provide services commonly across Europe. There's massive uncertainty over rules for foreign nationals working in Britain, and that still remains a concern. Many multinationals threatened to leave, and some relocated offices to Paris. Some others relocated to Northern Ireland, which negotiated to remain in the EU in 2019. So, with that uncertainty, we have firms that are choosing to operate and organize themselves differently. And again, we're talking about the choice of the UK to remain or to leave the EU. We're not talking about a calamity. We're not talking about a devastating event. This is a political event that has strong economic implications. So that's why it's important that we understand it through the context of the balance of payments. So, big picture, we should be comfortable with the balance of payments. Hopefully, we're comfortable with the current account. We know that's where the trade of goods and services and interest and dividend income get accounted for. We've seen that it seems to be sensitive to changes in exchange rates, and we can understand how that might be different for an importer versus an exporter. And a lot of that is going to depend on how sensitive your goods or your services are to changes in prices. We also hopefully understand what a current account surplus is and a current account deficit. So now, when someone in the news or in the media or in financial press discusses the US trade deficit, you'll have a good understanding of what's being talked about. We also should be very comfortable with the capital account. The book calls it the financial account, but the book is the only place that calls it the financial account. So that capital account is where we have foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. And again, hopefully we're comfortable with the surplus when we have more foreign investment that comes in versus domestic investment that goes out, and then a deficit, the exact opposite. Hopefully, we're also comfortable with the idea of the global imbalance and the global savings glut. These were sort of two sides of the coin. The global imbalance, because we have some countries that export so much, and we have some countries that import so much. This is sort of a way to understand that. And then the global savings glut, we have countries that, as a consequence of exporting, accumulate large savings and then are looking for markets that have price appreciation or at least stability in exchange rates, and those tend to be places that run financial account surpluses like the US and the UK. We should be comfortable with Brexit. We know Britain left the EU. We know it caused massive uncertainty for the flow of goods, services, and people. No longer, because leaving the EU, you no longer have access to the common market. You no longer have access to all of the flow of capital and everything else. And as we said, it's especially tough for financial services. So we know that if you're a bank, this has been an especially difficult time. Our next lecture is going to look at the international monetary system. So we're going to change things up. And instead of getting into a trade war, we're going to look at currency crisis. This would be a good way for us to talk about market efficiency and hopefully get into some limits to arbitrage. Where are we headed? After we cover our next major international topic, we'll delve more into corporate finance. So we'll get into corporate governance, and then our other two lectures after that are going to be on financial options. So we'll look at financial options as a way of hedging this exchange rate risk that we've seen is important. And then we'll look at real options as a way of identifying when, as a financial manager, we should wait. Is it worthwhile to wait? And this will be a good way for us to understand foreign direct investment. So for your next lesson, please read chapter 2. Go ahead and work through the example problems that are in the lecture. The assignment that's going to be due has already been posted. Thank you.